because you are going to start working on your collars next.
Yay!
You know, one of the things we've talked about with interfacing is that it can be anything, right? You know, we know that if you go to the store, there is the interfacing section. But interfacing, I mean, if you were to open, like, especially a baseball cap from like the 40s to the 50s, what's inside the brims of those caps?
Paper.
Cardboard, paper, something like that. You know, and so the notion of like cutting up a cereal box to be able to turn it into the brim of a hat is not actually a ridiculous thought at all. Interfacing, especially historically, presents two problems. Think about your collar. Hopefully you realize that in the long run, you're going to have two layers of fashion fabric that are your collar, right? One here and one here. And then the interfacing has to live in between those two layers, right? So how do you get it, say it is cardboard, how do you get it to be able to live in between those two layers? And historically, that's kind of the problem, because you really only have two ways to solve that problem. Your first choice is to take your paper or your cardboard or whatever and sew it in, right? But here's the thing. If I have my collar and then I have the seam allowance around all of the edges, when I go to cut my interfacing, what am I cutting? How much of that am I cutting out of my paper or my cardboard or whatever I'm putting in?
Slightly less.
Slightly less, right? Why do we know it's slightly less? Because it has to fit inside, right? So if I'm going to sew the two together, where does my line of sewing end up happening?
Around it.
Well, yes, around it, to be able to hold, because presumably what I'm doing is I'm taking that piece of cardboard and I'm attaching it to one of those two layers of fashion fabric, and so I'm going to sew all the way around. But where is that line of sewing if my cardboard is smaller than the actual piece of fabric? Doesn't it mean that the line of sewing has to be visible right here to be able to hold the two in place? Who'd I lose?
Keep going. Just keep going.
Okay, let me start over with some visuals instead of just talking.
Please and thank you.
I always only grab one piece of paper and then I draw like 3 pages worth. I'm gonna grab 2 this time.
And draw 5 pages worth.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so tell me if this makes sense. Let's pretend for the moment that this is your collar pattern. Looks a little bit like that. There's center back, right? We know if you're going to make the collar itself, you need 2 layers of fabric, right? So you need 2 pieces that look like that, and they've got seam allowance on all of the edges to be able to assemble, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay, so our interfacing, our cardboard, since I keep calling it cardboard, we know that we need to cut another one of these in this shape out of the cardboard, right? But as Catherine has noted, it has to be smaller to fit inside. So we know one thing right off the bat, it doesn't have any seam allowance to it, does it?
No.
And it may be just a wee bit smaller. You know, it may be one of those instances where I cut slightly to the inside of the line instead of right on the line. So if I take this and it's slightly smaller than this, I lay it on top of here to sew in place. So let's do this to be able to indicate that the one piece has been laid on top of the other. If I'm going to sew the 2 pieces together, where does my line of sewing have to go?
If you're sewing the interfacing to the...
Correct.
Ah, okay.
Where does my line of sewing have to go?
Has to go in a little bit.
It has to go over here someplace, right?
Oh, I remember this.
So now what's happened is, isn't that line of sewing visible on the exterior of the piece of fabric?
Yeah.
So we run into this funny problem with interfacing about how big to cut it and how we're actually going to install it. Did you or you do the intermediate millinery project in costume tech?
I did.
So how did you think about that hat for a minute? Do you remember how this assembly happened?
Yes.
How did this assembly happen? Because here at the brim, we're looking at the exact same thing, the exact same approach.
So you ended up, you cut the pieces out according to the pattern, and then you cut out the interfacing according to the pattern, but then you took in the interfacing a little bit. It was like by a tiny little amount, like 1/4 of an inch or something. And then you had to try to work it in there, and then you had to sew it.
You had to sew the two pieces together first like this to be able to create an envelope, and then you slid the cardboard inside. And as you can tell from Connie's tone of voice, trying to slide it inside is not particularly easy. It's a total bitch, and feel it. How secure does it feel?
Not bad.
No, I mean, the truth is, if this is for, if this is something you're buying to wear, like in your own life, it's probably okay. But for theater purposes, it starts to become a real problem because this thing is going to get battered on stage and backstage. There's no two ways about it. And so we have to find a way to be able to make it more secure. So what do we do? Up until fusible interfacings came into fashion and were really chemically engineered properly, this was the only thing you could do. And so that's why, if you think historically about like a turn of the century man's shirt, dress shirt, that's why the collar was just made of the paper. Because then you didn't have to go through the rigmarole of trying to slide something inside of something else and then hoping that it's going to stay together. Why are we discussing this? Because you're headed for your collar. Your collar needs interfacing in it. We elected not to put interfacing inside your placket, but we are going to put it inside the collar. Why did we elect to not put it in the placket, but we are going to put it in the collar?
Would
The
add
plaque.
bulk in the placket. It would add bulk in the placket.
Part of what I said was it's going to add a whole bunch of bulk in the placket, right?
It also makes it super stiff.
And it makes it super stiff. Is it going to not add bulk in the collar?
A little, but it's pretty thin already.
The collar needs to be able to stand up and give shape to it, whereas the placket needs to be able to move with the body.
This time, the bulk is actually the good news in a way, and the stiffness that the interfacing is going to create is the good news. Because, as Connie noted, what we're trying to do with the collar is actually get it to defy gravity. We want it to stand up and be crisp and hard, so we are going to take advantage of that extra bulk and that extra crispness here. Here, we didn't want it to be quite so stiffy. If you were to go buy any kind of pattern at, like, say, Joann's, any commercial pattern, there's a couple of standards that are really important that come out of that. The first thing they'll tell you, okay, let's go back to the diagram of our collar. We know that we're cutting 2 pieces of fabric with seam allowance, right? These 2 pieces, even though they're cut in the exact same way, from the same fabric, and with the exact same seam allowance, they actually have 2 different names. And you've heard these names before, because we've talked about it a little bit. What are they called? Take a look at my shirt as an example, because you can see I've got 1 layer of fabric here, and I've got a second layer of fabric there. Same thing here versus here. What is this called, this piece, and what is this piece called?
The wrong side and the right side.
You're headed in the right direction. This one right here, the one that will be on top when we go to fold it all in place, the one that the world will see, is referred to as the collar. The one that's underneath is referred to as the facing. We've talked about this a little bit, I think, with your plackets, that you're sort of starting to create facings here. We talked about it a little bit with sleeve cuffs. The fact that you have the cuff and the cuff facing. What makes something a facing?
It's facing the skin? No.
Well, I mean, actually, that's probably a good kind of mnemonic way to think about it, but that's not actually why it's called the facing. Think about my shirt cuff for a minute. What we really care about is this piece right here that's on the outside that the world can see, right? And so I could get away with cutting just one of these and sewing it on. If I only cut one of these to sew on, what problem would that create?
You'd see more of the sewing.
Can you be more specific?
Because here you can have that kind of seam there where you can't really see it.
You'd have some sort of raw edge if this were only a single layer, and the facing allows us to be able to finish off that edge, right? Same thing is true both here and here, and it's true right there as well. So the facing, you'll actually, a lot of times you'll hear Brenda and I use facing as both a noun, like as a facing, but we'll also refer to it as a verb, that we are using a piece of fabric to face this off. And the reason that we're using it as a verb that way is because to face something off means that we're clean finishing all of the edges. We're finding a way to contain all of that seam allowance. Because the truth is, going backwards for a minute, we don't need a second piece. We could leave enough seam allowance here and here that we could do some sort of little roll and stitch or something like that. We could introduce a little binding back in here to be able to clean finish all of this off. There's more than one way to be able to finish off a raw edge. In this instance, we want a facing. The facing is actually really helpful structurally because it will help keep the thing from falling apart more quickly. So the reason I mention this is because if you go to Joann's and you buy a commercial pattern, one of the things they're always going to tell you is you have your two layers. You've got your fashion layer and you've got your facing layer. Which layer gets the interfacing?
The facing?
The facing always gets the interfacing. The fashion layer does not get the interfacing. Why? Let's go back to this example right here, because this is kind of where the standard began. If a line of sewing had to be visible, which layer would you want it to be visible on? This one or this one? On the facing layer. The truth is, structurally, it's also better because you want this layer right here to have the same appearance and feel as all the rest of this. And so the structure is actually being introduced, the support layer is being introduced on the back side because it can make everything look very, very different. If you go to Joann's again and get one of those patterns, and they give you the list of cut 2 of these and cut 4 of those, they're going to tell you to use your pattern piece. There's your collar pattern piece right there. They're going to tell you, cut your collar facing, and then cut one collar out of interfacing that doesn't have any seam allowance. I'm going to tell you, don't follow their directions. Why? Well, let's take a look at the interfacings themselves for a minute. One of the things that we know, especially for your fabric, for your shirts, it's already kind of chunky, right? So especially with seam allowance and stuff inside there, it's not going to have a whole lot of difficulty defying gravity on its own. So we don't need a ton of interfacing in there to be able to hold the whole thing up and support it, create the structure that we need. There are essentially 2 types of interfacing. Well, I'm going to say 3 types of interfacing that we tend to use pretty regularly. And even though I say we in this room, I would say, you know, since Brenda and I both, and Marcus all come from a more New York background, which means that our education and experience is based in both fashion and theater, I would say that even though I'm talking about our shop in particular, I don't know that I've worked in a professional shop that has worked a whole lot differently. There are essentially three types of interfacing that you're talking about using. The first one, which is the most obvious one, is a woven fusible. So what does that mean? If you touch this stuff, wow, that is some durable tying of this roll.
You wanted it to be secure.
All right, touch this right there. What do you feel?
It feels a little bit like cotton, except it feels a little sticky.
It is 100% cotton, and it's actually relatively lightweight. So it's not papery, cardboardy like we've been talking about. And Connie's right; it has fusible. It is a fusible interfacing. You can purchase this non-fusible as well. In the long run, I think I will always choose fusible because it just saves a lot of time and effort, and we're going to talk about how and why in a minute. So you can purchase a woven fusible interfacing. The thing that's important, there are two things that are important here to remember. First of all, Connie said it felt gluey on the one side. That is important with all of these interfacings that are fusible. The very first thing you want to do is touch them to be able to determine what side the glue is on and what the side the glue isn't on. Because what happens if you lay the thing down with the glue side in the wrong direction?
It's going to glue on something else.
It's going to glue onto something else, namely
The iron.
the iron, because all of this is heat and steam activated. Your second option, I like this woven interfacing a lot. There are two things that I don't like about it. The first thing is it is woven. So what does that mean right off the bat?
There's a straight grain and a...
There's a grain, and so it requires squaring up and lining up and blah, blah, blah. The second thing is because of the cotton backing, because of the cotton, it tends to be very, very stiff. So that's really good news in some places and really bad news in other places. If it's a place that we want light support, this is not our choice. Feel this one next. This is the one that I tend to use the most frequently.
It's definitely silky.
Connie says it's definitely silky.
Well, it's synthetic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking from what Connie's describing, what she means is that it's flowy. It's not as crisp as this stuff is, which is part of the reason that I like it, because it's a much lighter weight support. This is what do they call it? The brand name for this is Easy Knit Fusible.
What?
And the thing that's nice about this Easy Knit is it comes in a couple of different weights. But there is a word there that's super important. What word is super important in the name of it?
Use...
Knit.
Knit.
Knit. Fusible is important. But knit, what does that mean?
It means that
It doesn't have a grain, and it has a certain amount of flexibility to it. That's the other thing that I really like about working with knits as opposed to working with wovens, is they have that certain amount of flexibility to them and that certain amount of softness. So take a look at my collar for a minute. Being able to have something inside here that's knit is going to change the way that all of this rolls than if it's woven. Think about, in a way, it's the difference between cutting something on the bias versus cutting something on the grain. And you know from what you've seen in your draping that the grain can sometimes make things very clunky, can make it very crunchy. So we tend to use this a lot. We refer to this is a certain kind of knit. It's actually tricot, which is spelled Tricot.
Sorry, can you spell it again?
Or you can look right there where I just wrote it.
Tricot.
Tricot. It's a French word, and it's just the way in which it's knit. And in fact, if you were to look at like cheap undies, like nylon panties and stuff, they are tricot. They're just a heavier weight tricot, especially like granny panties and stuff like that. Your third option is this gray one right here. And of course, these come in varying colors. They come in varying weights. This is what's referred to as Armo weft. Armoweft. It's also fusible. The Armoweft has quite a bit more body to it, but it is also a knit and not a woven. So it's kind of a good middle ground between these two. And so generally, when Brenda and I are working, we're going to be working with one of the three of these. And if you go to Joann's, you're going to see anything that's fusible, that's for sale there, is sort of falls into one of these three categories. They do also sell Pellon. You can see Pellon is actually the brand name. It's like the company that has manufactured or has copyrighted and manufactures a lot of these interfacings. But Pellon is a lot like paper. You can buy interfacing that's just like the paper, and I hate working with that stuff because it falls apart in the wash and it's difficult to work with and blah, blah, blah. So I will always go with one of these. There is a certain problem that all of these present when you go to work with them. Going back to my diagram over there, if you go to Joann's and buy one of those patterns again, for your collar, it's going to tell you to cut 3 pieces. It's going to tell you to cut the collar, it's going to tell you to cut the collar facing, and then it's going to tell you to cut the interfacing without any seam allowance on it. Feel that stuff right there. Touch it again. If you go to cut your collar out of this without any seam allowance, what are you going to end up with in your hand?
These horrible, like, frayed edges.
You're not necessarily going to get a lot of fraying.
It's going to be incredibly flexible. It's not going to hold up very well.
Part of the problem is it is flexible, which makes it really great for what we want, but it makes it really difficult to work with. And so one of the things, and Brenda, I would love for you to weigh in on this as well. I will always tell people to fuse yardage first.
And then cut and then trim it off.
Then cut. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, instead of taking your fashion fabric and cutting your individual collar pieces, I'll tell you, get enough fabric, get a scrap that's big enough to cut whatever you need to out of it, cut a piece of interfacing that's the same size, fuse the whole thing together, and then cut it out. Especially when you look in fashion patterns, the interfacings tend to be long, like my shirt. They're going to want a long, skinny rectangle to go right there. Well, a long, skinny rectangle cut out of a piece of knit fabric turns into this. And then you try and put the whole thing back together, and even though you cut the two from the same pattern, they are not the same at all. And they end up torquing each other. What do you think, Trudes? Mm-hmm.
So it's alright. So it's alright to have interfacing like in the seam allowance?
Haha, Catherine sees the problem. That means you end up with interfacing in your seam allowance. Is that the good news, the bad news?
It's the news.
It's the news. If you could see Brenda behind you while she's looking at me, she's going, she's making it's the news head bob. It's one of the things that you sort out as you are working through the process. You're ultimately going to make a decision about whether it's the good news or the bad news. Kristen is correct. You could fuse your yardage, cut the whole thing, and then peel off some of the interfacing and chop it away if you wanted to. In the long run, the thing that's interesting is what's actually adding the stiffness a lot of times is not the interfacing itself. It's the glue that's holding the two together. And so even when you go to peel it back, you're losing the interfacing, but guess what you're leaving behind? The glue. Which is 9 times out of 10, it's not the bad news. For me, especially for theater and performance use, I kind of don't mind it going into the seam allowance, because think about the way that these things are going to be treated. You're going to be on stage at bare minimum, Trial of God, they're sitting around and talking for 2 hours, sweating their asses off in front of the audience underneath stage light. What's that going to do to anything that's stiff?
It's going to break it down.
It's going to start to break it down. At maximum, you're putting it in something and then dancing for an hour and a half in it, right? That's really going to break it down. And then, of course, what are you going to do after the show? Wash it. So for me, starting out with it a little overly stiff is not the bad news, because it's going to start to break down even when you start to work with it, much less when you actually start to use it.
I was surprised at how, like, when I was thinking interfacing and you were talking about cardboard and paper, I was thinking something stiff. But because of the glue, it creates the stiffness. So that's what paper is, isn't it? It's like
Pretty
fiber
much.
and glue.
It's pulp and glue. You know, and it's funny because it's one of those interesting moments where you think about, say, plywood. What is it that actually makes plywood strong?
The glue.
The glue that's holding the layers together. I mean, some of it has to do with the interaction of the grain of the wood, but mostly it has to do with the glue. It's funny when you think about welding, when you think about, you know, I spend a lot of time watching like house flipping shows on HGTV, and you know, one of the things that everybody wants now is open concept. Knock down that wall, knock down that wall. In order to be able to do that, you have to put those giant beams in the ceiling, right? And the way that they make those giant beams is they take like 4 or 5 1x6s and they put them next to each other. And how do they attach them together? Glue. They put a couple of screws in afterwards, but in all of those instances, what happens is it's the part around the glue that falls apart first. When you go to weld something, the weld is the last thing that falls apart. It's all the steel around it. And this actually follows the exact same set of principles, that it's the glue that's actually doing the work and not necessarily the fabric. So when you go to produce the collars for your shirt, you are going to actually cut 2. You're going to cut a collar, and you're going to cut a collar facing. And guess what you're going to do to that collar facing?
You're going to fuse some fusing.
You're going to fuse some yardage to it first, before you cut it out. There are a couple of pattern modifications that need to happen to your current collar pattern before you're ready to cut them out. The first thing is a me thing. I want to look at each of you about with the math. I want to look at the math. So what do I mean by that? I want to look at what the circumference of the neckline of your shirt is, to be able to make sure that the neckline itself isn't too small. Because you've all done a good job of draping directly to your form, but again, we've talked a little bit about the theory of concentric circles, I think. Have we talked about that at all?
You could talk about it again.
What is it? Oh, because I know I talked about it in costume tech, but I don't know that we talked about it in here. This is an important, important thing.
Are you just talking about how it will suffocate the person?
Well, kind of. Think about Spanish or Russian nesting dolls, or for me, all of the stupid little silver bowls that live underneath the sink in my kitchen. They all nest inside each other, right? 1 goes inside 2, 2 goes inside 3, etc. What is it that allows, if you're thinking about Russian nesting dolls, what allows one doll to go inside the next?
They're smaller.
They're smaller. So if the circumference of my neck is 15 inches, what does the circumference of my shirt collar want to be?
Slightly bigger.
It wants to be bigger, right? Otherwise, you know, you start constricting things. And this actually starts to become really important. If you think for a minute about Tartuffe, the ladies, they had on, some of them had butt pads, then they had petticoats, then they had skirts, then they had overskirts, then they had bodices. How many concentric circles are we talking about fitting around one of those ladies' waists?
Too many.
A lot.
7.
And so one of the things that needed to happen was each of those things needs to be commensurately larger. So I want to make sure before you guys cut your collars that we take a look at the measurement of the neckline and make sure that your collar doesn't need to be, your neckline doesn't need to be expanded just a little bit to make sure that they're wearable. Because again, we're actually going for stage use. And this is another example of where theater is different than costume, or costumes are different than fashion. Because look at how I'm wearing my shirt. Does it matter if this thing is a little too small for me? This is not really a shirt that was ever intended on being worn like this. It was, it's a casual shirt. It's not a dress shirt. On stage, these things are intended to be worn closed, and what do they have to be able to do inside them?
Sing and talk.
Sing, talk, dance, breathe. Am I as concerned about singing and talking and dancing if I'm sitting at my desk working in front of a computer for 6 hours? Breathing is helpful. Knowing me, I'm going to want to talk. But the rest of it, it's not. I'm not like going jogging in it.
Mistake.
Yes, exactly. So, you're going to cut 2 collars. You're going to cut a fashion one, and you're going to cut a facing that is fused yardage. What interfacing are you going to put inside your collar?
How stiff do you want it?
What a good question. Let's take a minute and do a sample. So here's what I want you guys to do. Find some scrap of your fabric, and you guys can do this as a group. Everybody doesn't have to do it individually.
there might be some.
Find a scrap of your fabric that's maybe 2 by 2. Cut a 2 by 2 square of each of these, and let's fuse them and see how they feel. Because ultimately, guess what Brenda and I do every time we're trying to make this decision?
Sample.
Sample.
We do a sample. So let's do one.